Welcome to the Makers Camp portion of Catharsis on the internet. This is a very interesting experience for all of us, and we want to share with you some inspiration on how to live a regenerative lifestyle. We'll be bringing a couple of our friends on to talk about that. We're here at the Reed Center right now, and really getting our hands dirty in some plants and nature, because you can't live a more sustainable life than being out in the forest and planting trees and getting into the dirt. So first of all, we wanted to open this space up for an opportunity to connect with someone near you or a friend virtually, and just like a little icebreaker question. A question was asked to me a few days ago that really resonated. And so if there's someone near you or in the chat, feel free to ask someone, or even call your parents or send them a text. But the first question is, what is something that you are proud of that most people don't know about you? So what's something that you're proud of that most people don't know about you? Take a few minutes. I'm gonna break some people in the Zoom into breakout groups. And
all right. So Zoom allows for us to facilitate smaller connection groups. So with that, I think Davis is going to be able to break up. I think there's about 10 people in the live stream right now. So thank you guys all for being here, and curious on what your answers are, and take notes on them and share them with us in just a moment here. Where are people watching from? Comment in the chat where you guys are. Curious where on the East Coast you are. We may be able to share some advice and insight on certain plants that are good for that area, and yeah, learn about where people are. We're getting some answers there. Maryland?
I'm down in Maryland.
It's not pulling up.
Can I see?
Facebook stream. This is very, very new to us. Hold on 1 second. I'm gonna rejoin this.
Well, in the meantime, Catharsis on the Mall has been an event that we've participated in for the last, this is the 3rd year that we have. It's a radically inclusive, they call it a vigil for healing, because it's really built on the idea of making an event radically accessible to the public, whereas Burning Man typically has been very hard to get to. It has like a very large barrier to entry because it costs hundreds of dollars to get there. Finding a ticket is very difficult. Becoming a part of the camp and preparing all the materials to get all the way out to the Nevada desert is not an easy feat. So Davis was able to go last year, and due to COVID, we all know that Burning Man has been canceled this year. So these virtual events are even more important. Specifically, Catharsis on the Mall was a free event to anyone in the DC area, because it was literally on the mall and a public space. There was no fencing, like, you know, a lot of festivals these days have big fences, they have large ticket prices. You have to have some sort of, you know, affluence and money to go to them sometimes, or you have to work as a part of a group in order to get there. So this event was very special to us because we would set up a camp, like a little zone, and curate a space. Creating space is really important to our group, as we believe that it's important to create a space to facilitate connection. Unless you have a comfortable space, people, it's harder for people to connect. So for us, creating space that was comfortable is really important to us. So at Catharsis, you've got young kids coming into spaces, as well as parents, adults, millennials, all gathering in a location and exploring and taking different classes. You've got workshops going on, as well as music sets and activities. Last year they had a foam camp, which allowed people to get down in their bathing suits and wash themselves on the National Mall with Dr. Bronner's soap. So sponsored by Dr. Bronner's, and it was pretty fun to see people kind of getting out of their element on a place where they would normally could never think they could do that. So Catharsis has got a very special part in our heart, and especially the ending parade 2 years ago, we ended up parading with a disco tank art car along Constitution Avenue on the day that Trump was supposed to have his military parade. So at 8 a.m. in the morning, you've got hundreds of individuals marching along behind an art car, blasting music, and people dancing around. So it was quite a special sight, and we're definitely a little sadness in our heart that it's not going on this weekend. However, it's awesome to be able to curate something for you guys and hold space for the event. Yeah.
So we have and had something very special planned. We actually spent a couple days filming prior to this to create a very engaging video and to do some live Q&A at the end. But life always doesn't happen the way we want it to. So we are going to be still preparing that video for you all, and will be done today before the burn at midnight. And we were going to screen share and show a couple of those clips, but for the integrity of that piece of art that we created, I think it would be best if we waited a little bit on that and instead took this time to introduce some of our friends here at the Reed Center and talk a little bit about what we're doing here and why we keep talking about the Reed Center and really what is the best way to live a regenerative lifestyle. So first I'd like to introduce Ben Fritton. This is Ben. Hello, everybody.
Hello, everybody.
Also we have Bobby here, Bobby Moses. Thank you. So you'll see them a little later in the video, and we'll be posting that on Facebook, on Instagram for you all. Actually, yeah, Instagram TV, you can have along the videos. So I was getting a little stressed out just then, and I realized that my laptop wasn't the host for the Zoom call, and because I started with the phone first, so we would have had to end that and start it here to share to Facebook Live. So apologies for you all. We're still learning. All of us are learning every day and getting better. So first of all, I'd like to give Ben a quick opportunity to introduce himself and what we're doing here at the Reed Center.
Hey everybody, I have never been to Catharsis on the Mall. To have an opportunity to actually share in this space is really exciting for me, and I cannot wait to go once it actually happens in a physical fashion.
In November, so it's
it is happening in November.
We rescheduled it until the first week of November, as long as things get better with COVID, which they look to be. So yeah.
Beautiful. So I am the founder of the Reed Center for Ecosystem Reintegration here. Basically, our work revolves around figuring out ways in which we can, instead of the standard model that we see around the world, which is like, let's set aside areas where nature can thrive and humans can be over here. And then, you know, as we need to keep encroaching on those natural areas for things like fracking and all of the other things that we keep going into our national parks to extract, instead of that kind of let's keep us separate from nature, recognizing that we are the dominant force on this planet. In fact, it's often called the Anthropocene or the Anthropocene. It is the age of human beings. We do more to shift the geology of this planet than any other force. That includes water, that includes, you know, we are doing that. So if we don't recognize that and figure out a way in which we can actually meet our needs from thriving ecosystems, you know, largely we're working towards an end that is something that you can see for those of you that have never been on Google Earth time lapse. I am an evangelical of Google Earth time lapse. Please go on it. It is the most important look perhaps that we've ever had as a species. We're talking a multi-generational look. So we're just like Google Earth. It's 35 years, 36 years, starting in 1984, which happens to be the year of my birth, to the present. You can see a time lapse of every spot of Earth. It doesn't quite zoom in the way you can on like a singular household on Google Earth. So it doesn't zoom quite as far in, but nonetheless, it is an objective look. For the first time in human history, we can see the multi-generational collateral effects of the decisions that we are collectively making. And
I can actually share one right now.
oh, beautiful. Yeah, that's Dubai.
Here we go.
So you can actually see that 1 in 10 rivers, major rivers on Earth, no longer reach their end because we're usurping that water for irrigation. The 4th largest lake in the world dried up in 2007 and 2008, the Aral Sea, because of irrigation for cotton production. So in looking at things that, frankly, none of us would click, I support that. And if we were to actually, poll who's in favor of, this kind of environmental destruction, of course, none of us would be for these things. The reality is that there is a level of plausible deniability between our decision making and what those collateral effects are on the greater environment. Here, what we're doing is we're trying to marry the reforestation work that we need to do for the rest of humanity. I don't think anybody is going to question that reforestation work is going to be work that we're going to have to do indefinitely. But that reforestation work often just gets cut down because you can't go into places where people have needs for tomorrow and say, oh, in like 25 years, this forest is going to be great for the environment. Well, what if I can cut down that forest and turn it into charcoal, and that charcoal is immediate income for my family so I can feed my family? And then that soil that is now improved from having 7 to 8 years of this forest growing, this improved soil, is now great for agriculture, where I can sell that food or sell that product and feed my family. What if we can grow forests that can be overtly more valuable standing than cut down? What if we can grow forests that can actually meet the acute human needs that we have on a daily basis? So that's generally the work that we are doing here at the Reed Center.
Finding ways to harmonize with nature and work with nature instead of fight it.
So how did you two meet, and why are you so excited about permaculture? And what is permaculture anyway?
I actually, the first time I met Ben, he was doing what I call the Ben Fritton special, which is where he takes people through the Google Earth time lapse and really catches people up on what's happening with the state of the world, and is like, does this seem sustainable? Do these systems, and really gives you a big picture look. So it was at Rooting DC, an event many people may know, a free agricultural based event in DC. And I went to a talk, and afterwards, he breaks you down real hard. He builds you up in a way that's really beautiful, and focused around reharmonizing with nature and rediscovering the brilliance of nature and working with those systems.
Ooh, this is Saudi Arabia, so that's live, right? Did you see that?
Yeah.
That is a Saudi Arabian, largely growing alfalfa in the middle of the deserts to feed cattle, which red meat, beef is a growing trend all across the Middle East, particularly in Saudi Arabia. And what you see over and over again is cities growing at an unprecedented rate. I think, one of the things that I think human beings do that is particularly interesting is that we're always looking for precedent, right? That makes us feel comfortable. Like, when we're talking about economic downturns, like, what happened in 1918 during the Spanish flu? So we get a better sense of what's going to happen in the stock market, because that's the precedent we have for the times that we're living in. One of the things that's really uncomfortable to look at is that we're in unprecedented times. There's never been a world of nearly 7.5 billion people. There's never been a world that's the majority of the people are now living in urban environments. What does that do to the global landscape. We have fewer and fewer people producing more and more food. The fewer and fewer people you have producing more and more food, that means that they have to use more and more environmental destructive methodologies to produce that food. So that's everything from, using pesticides rather than, if you have a backyard garden, you can go out and weed. Try weeding a 600-acre corn farm. That's not possible.
So what do they do instead?
So, what you're talking about, industrial agriculture in particular. So, right now what's happening in industrial agriculture is something that I think we have to look at in two ways. One, that I wouldn't be alive, and neither would any of you here, if it wasn't for industrial monoculture agriculture. As an ecologist, that's not a comfortable thing for me to admit. In fact, it took me a long time to come to that realization. That, in fact, the calories that I'm using to speak to you guys right now, most of them came from monocultures. Now, I've been eating some wild food growing out here. We're just starting off on this particular plot of land to build this super diverse food forest that we're developing. But frankly, where we're at is very much a scenario in which I wouldn't be able to do the level of scientific experimentation that I'm doing right now if I did not have food supplies that, even in these crazy times where we're wasting an extraordinary amount of food, there's enough food to feed somebody like us that are trying to do this work. So I think that is a very important perspective to have. The other thing that I think is really important to remember is that the precedent of this model of agriculture is nearly 10,000 years old or older. And when you look at the Fertile Crescent where wheat came from, or if you look at China where rice came from, and Central America where corn came from, the places where these three plants originated, I think is very important to recognize, which is that all three of those plants are annual grasses. And in fact, almost all of us are living exclusively off of annual-based foods. That's the bulk of the calories that we consume. So when you think about what is required for annual plants to thrive, let's look at those three plants that I just talked about. Wheat, number one, rice, number two, corn, number three, the most widely grown plants on the entire planet. Those plants originated in places where natural disasters were the norm. So wheat production came in the Fertile Crescent where there were floodplains that brought in all of this silt, this soil that would literally cake over the ground in which they grew the previous year. That did two things. One, that brings an extraordinary amount of new nutrition into that ground, right? The second thing is it wipes out all other plant life that would have been competing with it. So they could just plow through that like really hard, crusty top, get into that new, fresh soil beneath that, and plant in that wheat with no competition. And then when you look at rice, it's the same story. Those originated in floodplains. Corn largely originated in areas where there were lots of fires. So what are we doing today that actually mimics those exact things? And in fact, all industrial agriculture today and all monocultures that we're doing today have to mimic that process. Because as soon as an annual crop, let's just imagine, I'm sure all of you guys have seen cornfields or wheat fields. Imagine if you let all of those go to seed. 100% of the seed stock, none of it's harvested by human beings. All of that now falls to the earth. The next year, how much corn are you going to get out of that same field? How much wheat are you going to get out of that same field, or rice? The reality is, yeah, probably none, except for the little bit that was carried off by a bird that found a spot where there were no other plants growing in that area, and then that seed could germinate. In fact, that's why these grains are so powerful, because they produce so much grain specifically for the biological purpose of knowing that they have to disperse their seed as widely as possible to have any hope of another plant germinating. So in our cornfields, in our wheat fields, and in our rice paddies that we have artificially produced all over the world, what we have to do is, 1, burn is the most common thing that we do. 2, plow, second most common thing that we do. And then lastly, use herbicide. Those 3 things are quite literally being done on 1/3 of the land surface of the entire planet of Earth right now.
Every year, right?
Every single year. Sometimes multiple times a year. And when you think about it like that, there is absolutely no surprise when you start looking at Google Earth time lapse as to where we find ourselves today. So, yeah, I'll just kind of end this little thought bubble that we're in, with a kind of a singular thing that I'd love for you guys to kind of toy around with in your brains going forward, which is that fertility doesn't guarantee peace, but infertility guarantees conflict. And right now we're finding ourselves in a scenario where more and more ground is being desertified, turning into desert every single year. Fewer and fewer rivers are producing the fish and, frankly, just the water that human beings need. And land is being depleted so rapidly that we're talking migrants. It's not just it's not just wars in Syria that cause refugees. We're talking most people on Earth are moving today because the lands in which they currently that they lived in are no longer able to support life, whether that be economically or environmentally. It was a bit of a ride.
It was.
Sorry.
Can I ask you one question on the tail end of that?
Yeah.
What would happen if all of a sudden on all that land we stopped creating those natural disasters every year? What would happen?
Well, so there is a number of things that we have to look at when you ask that question. It's not a one-size-fit-all answer. What I can say is right here on the East Coast of the United States, we have been beating this soil horribly for like 300, 400 years. Growing cotton, growing wheat, growing tobacco, which is a horribly usurpative plant. We've been growing corn and soy for the last 50 years in a very conventional manner. And yet, we can actually even pave over areas. Armand knows about this, our friend that's sitting over here. We take folks to a mall site that was taken down 30 years ago, and the rubble is just left there to actually avoid having forests regrow in that area, because in the world of industry or in selling real estate, the term that we use here in the United States for forests in a spot where you're trying to put real estate is overburden. So I just like, it's not just the forest that's growing that's overburden that you have to take down, it's also the topsoil. To remove that topsoil so that you can compact that earth so that it makes it ideal for real estate. So to avoid this overburden moving in, they left all of the rubble from the Landover Mall in that space. And yet nature is still taking over. It very much looks like that standard dystopian scene that you've seen in movies trying to depict that very thing. Now, there's other areas in the world that are not so fortunate. The arid places of the world that were hardwood savannas. So, for example, in the Central Valley of California and throughout California, there were oak savannas. Will those oak savannas return as quickly as a forest would return here? Here, we can let it go. Within 5 years, there are trees that are 25 feet tall. In those areas, those oak savannas took literally millennia in order to produce themselves, and root systems that would go down into the aquifers that were 300 feet deep. Now, those same aquifers that we've been using to irrigate massive, the most productive agricultural space on earth in the Central Valley, they're having in some cases 4-year waits on the well diggers that are going down 2,500, 4,000 feet to be able to produce those wells from those same aquifers. And to make it even worse, those aquifers have gone so far down that salt water from the ocean has started backfilling into those aquifers. What does that mean? Now we're using salt water to irrigate in those same spaces. What's going to happen when you use salt water? Just look at northern China, where desertification is happening on an epic scale. That salt water, it only accelerates desertification. So, you know, it's not a one-size-fits-all that nature just rebounds that quickly, but it is something that we can look at that no other generation has had an opportunity to look at before, which is that right now, we can see that certain regions of the world, like this one, do have that rebound ability. We have the environmental capability of being the breadbasket of the United States. But the economics of it says that right now, 90% of the entire agriculture in Maryland should be for corn production for animal feed. So obviously we're in the midst of a big shift where we're seeing that unsustainable forms of agriculture are showing their head. And that even sustainable forms of agriculture are straining in this decentralized, or excuse me, in this very centralized food system. But we are in this unique position in this extremely robust ecosystem to produce tens of thousands of varieties of different plants and animals right here.
Can you talk a little bit about the compaction that you told us about the other day, and kind of on the topic of desertification and like how the ground gets compacted by what we do?
Yeah, so I don't think it's going to be much of a surprise to people to hear that we are a species very much vested in compaction. Every single one of the buildings that you are in right now had very intentional compaction occur right underneath of it so that your building wouldn't sink and settle awkwardly and ultimately collapse. Most of our neighborhoods right now are being put in and built. Literally the entire ground space is run over with machinery with the intention of compacting all of that ground. Now, what that means is, by comparison, thriving ecosystems, their intention is to create avenues for water and oxygen. And when I say intention, that's ascientific. But I'm just going to use the ascientific terminology because I'm pretty sure ecosystems want to thrive. Yeah, I think it's pretty fair. So, what are the capacity of roots? The deepest roots in the world that we know of right now are 400 feet deep. That's in South Africa. Those, yeah, close. No, they're fig roots actually.
Fig roots.
Fig roots being hailed for thousands of years as the mother trees in Africa. Yet they did not have the scientific rigor to know that fig roots have the ability to penetrate 600 psi and go down this far into the soil. But they were smart enough to realize that, hey, wherever there's figs, it turns out that they can tap down into these water aquifers that are deep into the soil that they, had no scientific ability to know were down there. But around fig trees, within a half a kilometer around them, there tended to be oases because these roots would tap down really deep, find these water aquifers, and then slowly but surely the roots themselves and the microbiology that they have encasing those roots be able to break through the rock and get down into those aquifers, and then slowly but surely a spring would pop up and create oases. So this is the raw potential of roots. Now what we're doing is growing so many plants all over the planet, rice, corn, and wheat, particularly the most dominant plants on the entire face of this earth. where roots go down 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet max. And then we run tractors over that same space over and over and over again. And the compaction that's created at 3.5 to 4.5 feet down, water and oxygen and roots cannot penetrate. So think by comparison what the, let's say, drought tolerance of the Great Plains that had roots that went down in these wild grasses down 35, 40 feet down into the soil, and I would bet even further than that. Comparatively to what we're growing in the Great Plains right now, which is wheat and mostly corn, that are only going down 3 feet. You can imagine that as soon as you get down even 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet into the soil, nearly every spot of earth has a very constant temperature of 55 to 60 degrees. You're not going to have evaporation at that depth. So when we're planting our annual plants all over the planet, and those annual plants only put roots down about this far, by comparison, the dandelions that so many people are trying to get rid of in their lawns can literally have roots that go down 30 feet if you let them go long enough. You know, and not to mention that the dandelion is more nutrient dense than, bionutrient dense than almost anything that we're growing in our agricultural fields. Yes, compaction is absolutely the primary cause of the desiccation or the removal of water from soil all over this entire planet. And in fact, that water that we are capable of holding in our soils with organic matter and with roots, creating these easy pathways for water to get deeper and deeper into the soil. Those two things, if we just solved those two things, we would have all the fresh water that we would ever need on this planet. We would not have all of the water every time it rains right here in this region. We get these swells of water where all the water runs off of all of these fields, goes right down into the streams, right down into the river, the Potomac River that we have here, and it runs right out into the Potomac, into the Chesapeake Bay and out into the ocean. Imagine if that water was going down even 30 feet down into the soil, let alone when it's capable in some areas of going 100, 200, 300 feet down into the soil and slowly matriculating into our streams and rivers and things like that. The world would absolutely be able to regenerate itself extremely rapidly.
Wow. Speaking of regeneration,
yeah,
I want to go through real quick these 9 tips that we created. For those of you that just joined us, I want to thank you for joining us. I'm here with Ben and Bobby and Dylan. We're at the Reed Center. My name is Davis, and we have a piece of art that we've created for you all in the form of video, and it is still being processed. So thank you for your patience. We'll be uploading that after sometime in the next couple hours. It's at 65% right now. So
who knew uploads would be so slow with everybody being home?
Well, it must be everyone on the Catharsis live stream.
Yeah, I'm sure all of our neighbors are.
Yeah,
exactly.
So
they're watching that.
As you can tell, we're very passionate. I think a lot of people know that our human patterns and habits haven't been, you know, some of them have been very destructive to the planet. And it's clear to see that. What we want to focus on is what we can do in our lives to start living more harmoniously with the planet, to start living a more regenerative lifestyle. Because sustainability is cool, right? I think we're maturing to this idea of regeneration. Sustaining is simply that. It's sustaining, whether it's good or bad, it's sustaining for a period of time. But regeneration is planting trees. It's creating new life. It's creating newness in ourselves. And so first and foremost, regeneration comes from within. And literally your cells regenerating, white blood cells regenerate. If you do a 3-day fast, you know, your white blood cells regenerate. When we eat live fruits, get the H3O2, not just H2O, you know, living plants, that's regeneration. And we have to make sure that our body is a temple so that we can regenerate outside of our bodies and in our everyday lives. So again, that video will be prepared and uploaded later, but I just want to take some time to run through those with you all since you're here and present, and we don't want to hold you waiting any longer. So we'll just go through those 9 tips, starting with number 9, and maybe spend a couple minutes just talking about that idea and how it's applying in our lives. So number 9 on our list, living a zero waste lifestyle. So one of the most important things when you go to the grocery store is bags, right? You get your produce and things in bags. So even just that, bringing your own bags to the store, or even the reusable mason jars or any jar like that at the bulk section, you know, you can get cheaper food and you don't have to waste as much plastic. So real quick, what are some fun ways that you like to live a zero waste lifestyle?
Well, I'll just jump in here. I saw on Instagram an ad today for a device that resealed plastic bags. I think it might be maybe a heat sealer, but it was like a little device like this large. And I was thinking like, wow, even if we do end up getting those plastic bags, kind of inevitably,
Which we all get, right?
Yeah, inevitably we end up having them. Can we reseal them when we need plastic bags in the future? And you know, there are some uses for plastic bags. I think all of us can probably admit to that. But how can we extend the life of the plastic that we inevitably get?
Yeah, and talking about plastic, just on me real quick, I always carry around this like spoon fork thing, and the side is kind of a knife, but I mean, I use this every day. I use this every day. Yeah, nice. You know, yeah, come on in.
Yeah,
come on,
here.
Just sit right here, check out his shirt.
That's so funny.
We cannot plan this.
That's great.
So yeah, exactly. Another thing
Good
that I
coordination.
like to carry on me all the time is a metal straw. You know, anytime you want to drink a nice beverage, but these 2 things alone help save food, you know, tons of plastic, tons and tons and tons of plastic. And realistically, these straws are getting used one time and they're going straight to trash. So that's number 9, and we're going to go on to number.
You mind if I just touch a couple things on there?
Yeah.
So I think there's 2. I'm going to try to say these as quickly as possible. There's 2 things to recognize about waste that I think is really important for perspective. One is that when we talk about the Stone Age, when we talk about the historical people, the reason why we call it the Stone Age is not because we started making tools out of stone. It's because the only tools we can find and the only remnants we can find of those civilizations are the stone tools. They were actually in what I think should be called the Wood Age. Every human being throughout history had these things that they used on a daily basis, and all of them went back to the earth. And in fact, I think that's why it's so difficult for our generations, the very first generations, to have things that literally last indefinitely, that we don't know how to navigate that sphere. I just think that that's a really important thing for people to kind of give themselves a little bit of a break, but also recognize like, holy shit, we need to take that next step and realize that there has never been a plan to deal with something that lasts forever. That's new. That's a very new concept for humanity. So I just really wanted to share that, and I hope that that really helps put things into perspective for you.
Can I throw a quick thing in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Composting has been one of the greatest miracles that I've integrated into my life. I remember, you know, the trash would get stinky after a week. Like, oh, I got to take the trash out. It smells. When you're taking all of your organic material and recycling it back into the ecosystem, there are days like, man, I haven't taken this trash out in 3 weeks. It feels like a month, because it's just the few little bits of things that I can't recycle back that I'm trying to work out of my life. But when you give the bulk of the organic material that you're processing and not going to eat back to the environment, you're improving your environment, you're improving your soil, you're giving back, and you're not putting things in a landfill and covering it over with a tarp.
Yeah, and just as like an overview of this whole living a regenerative lifestyle, look at how ecosystems work. You asked what is permaculture earlier? At the most basic form, it's looking at how ecosystems function and thrive and trying to mimic that. And everything that the ecosystem that surrounds us does, every animal it produces, every leaf it produces, every branch, every single one of those things fall back to the earth and only increase the amount of life that it can support. And this is the primary thing that humans have broken in the chain. Every field that we eat from, every single farm that we are consuming from right now, the most nutrient dense components of that ecosystem are leaving it. They're being mined out of that ecosystem. And we don't ever return. We never bring those resources back to that ecosystem. So even the same foods that are being produced on the land today that were being produced on that same land 30 years ago, we're seeing bionutrient density losses that are mind-boggling. So I think that's a really important perspective to have as well.
Yeah, and one thing that just came to my mind real quick was the plastic, because like in my trash can, I'm pretty sure plastic is the most common thing, like not the hard plastics you can recycle. And bottle breaking is a simple way to take all that plastic and just shove it in a bottle and keep pushing it down until it's super tight. And then you can make bricks out of that and literally build structures. So there's so many ways to live a zero waste lifestyle. And by the way, these 6 through 9 tips 9, 8, 7, and 6, are about conscious consumerism. Okay, as consumers, we're consuming daily. And then the top 5 tips will be about conscious producerism and shifting more to creating things for ourselves and relying less on the oppressive systems that currently support the society that we live in. So, number 8, reclaimed and natural resources. So I'm sure a lot of you like to go to Goodwill and thrift stores. I'm pretty sure probably all of us are wearing something thrifted, but this goes more than just clothes. It's actually food. A lot of grocery stores have excess food that they literally throw out every day. Bobby works at Mom's Organic Market, one of my favorite stores to go.
Shout out to Mom's.
Yeah, and Mom's is amazing. And Mom's is an amazing store to get organic and natural foods. But even they still have excess of food that they can't sell. Fortunately, they give a lot of it to their staff, and we get to
compost it.
Yeah, and exactly, and compost it. But there's so much excess, and things like buckets and crates and a lot of these things that these stores are producing are available for us to use and build with those materials. Like bamboo is another one for making fences. Here we have built a terrace out of locust wood that grows really fast. It's super dense, very hard, and is available for us. So
it's my spirit animal.
Yeah. Does anyone have anything?
It also,
to add
yeah, it also the locust. It's also a nitrogen fixing plant. Like this idea that, I grew up thinking like, you grow a plant, and then when the plant runs out of things to eat, you feed it, and that's how plants work. Well, if that's how plants work, forests wouldn't exist, So there are all kinds of plants that actually produce excess of fertilizer for other plants. Locusts happen to be one of them. You can actually chop that tree down, and it'll just regrow, and it'll regrow even faster than it did the last time because all those roots are already established. And so, we're talking just this multifaceted organism that supports so much life.
Yeah. And on the topic of reclaimed resources, I got to give a shout out to Creative Labs. If you've been to Creative Labs in Baltimore, you already know what's good. But if you haven't, it's basically an upcycled art wonderland. And you look on the walls, and no, there's not wallpaper. There is. The walls are alive. It's hard to describe.
Yeah.
But
old pink.
yeah, like things like bicycles that were found in the trash that are hung up, and just painted and made into art. So, something just came to my mind was the little silica, the do not eat silica, and it comes in packaging and stuff like that to absorb the water. We put it in our tray of lids for mason jars and things like that, because sometimes they keep moisture and then they'll rust on the top. So finding fun ways to utilize all of the things we get. So next time you're about to throw something in the trash can, think about, can I make this into an art piece? Can I use this somewhere else? Can I ask my friend that might have an idea on how to use this? Because ultimately, the less that we're throwing to the trash and reincorporating back into our lives, the better.
Yeah, I said.
Anything else for 8?
I think that's great.
All right, moving on to number 7, plant-based living. So I'm sure many of you are already aware of the destruction of animal agriculture and just the current process of how things are working currently. But I'll just dive into it a little bit. The methane from the cows, the water usage, and the water pollution that's happening from these systems. But I also want to advise, just because it's vegan doesn't mean it's good either. There's a lot of palm oil, and there's a lot of almonds, exactly, in California, and things like that.
Can I speak to that a little bit? Yeah, so it's a really interesting thing, when we talk about agriculture is a mining process. I think one of the best examples that I would use of that is the Central Valley of California again, which is actually, I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that they're the #1 dairy producer. They're actually, they produce go down the list of nearly everything that we eat. They're the #1 producers of broccoli. They're #1 producer, like more than 90% of the strawberries we eat, more than 90% of the asparagus. You go down the list, and the Central Valley of California is up there. And all of that using this mined water, fossil water, and dairy being the largest consumer of it. And I think a lot of people are becoming aware of that. And so they're looking for alternatives. They're looking for an alternative to dairy. The #1 up and coming alternative to dairy is almond milk. And almond milk, 85% of the world's almond production is in the Central Valley of California. And it takes, in a good year, 1.1 gallons of water to produce one almond. And when you look at that and realize that on any given year, a big storm when the blossoms are out, or a late frost, or so many things, that the epic droughts that have been happening, it's actually more often than not, more than a gallon of water per almond. So I think it's really important, and this kind of goes to everything that we've talked about in these last 3, which is know where things come from. Do whatever you can to break the plausible deniability that we have between what our consumer decision making and what the collateral effects of those things are.
Which leads us into number 6, which is eating local. So he basically just touched on the idea of why it's so important to eat local, because that avocado in your salad came 3,000 miles from California or more, and or Mexico, and those are fossil fuel miles that are being used every day for your salad. So it's important to eat local, supporting the community food systems.
I think many people would be surprised to hear that you can actually grow avocados here. It doesn't take a heated greenhouse in order to be able to produce avocados. We are very much capable. We're in a sweet spot in the mid-Atlantic of the United States where we can actually grow citrus. We can grow, and those are in protected areas, like an unheated greenhouse. But we can also grow pomegranates in unprotected areas. We can grow figs. We can grow all these things that people would assume that are strictly southern or tropical type plants.
Yeah, and while we're on the subject of eating local, I want to mention something. We'll touch on it a little later, but the idea of victory gardens. And this is an idea that's relatively new to me, ironically, since it was so prevalent in World War II. But if you're not familiar with a victory garden, victory gardens were pushed by the United States government during World War II to empower local communities to garden for themselves, to feed themselves, so that we can be more resilient as a nation. And more than 50% of the food in our country, more than half of the food in our country was being grown out of these community-run victory gardens.
Yeah.
So eating local is more than just, it's also about creating. And again, we'll touch on that in a second, but if anyone wanted to touch on victory
Yeah,
gardens.
I love that. I mean, the victory gardens are just this profound example of what the current 40 million acres of lawn, which is the most irrigated crop in the United States, you know? Yeah, and it also uses more pesticides, more fertilizers than any other crop that we use. And that I think that would surprise a lot of people to hear. But all of that land, if we were to just make a shift to recognizing that these victory gardens that he's referring to from World War II, where they said they had Uncle Sam posters like, you can support the war effort, you know,
Grow food.
yeah, this, and I mean this in the most serious manner that I can mean anything. This is a homeland security initiative to have hyper-local sustenance infrastructure. Suddenly, I've been talking about this for years as, you know, kind of this like, not even theoretical, but like in the abstract. And suddenly we find ourselves in a scenario where that is so radically apparent. And it's not just for the food supply chain. I think it's most important for people to recognize that if we're growing food right here in our backyard, you are going to have radically healthier food, radically more bionutrient dense food. Bobby actually uses a term. What do you call that kind of food?
Medicinal grade food.
Medicinal grade.
It has the vitamins and mineral portfolio that it's supposed to have, and it was grown in a live soil in the sun and was vine ripened.
Yeah, this whole idea that you can go online and like, how much vitamin E does a tomato have? And the internet has an answer for you. They're like, oh yeah, it has all these vitamins, it has all these minerals. Yes, that's true if the soil has it. And it's important to remember that if that thing came from 3,000 miles away, they didn't pick it when it was ripe. The only way a nutrient enters into the body of that fruit is when it's attached to the umbilical of the parent. They pick those things when they're rock hard and green. That way they can ship all the way across country, and then they use ethylene gas for the ripening process. And it's not a toxic process. I don't want to scare anybody. It's no different than you putting your avocados in with some bananas, so the bananas which release that ethylene gas can ripen them quicker.
There's been a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Can anyone recommend farms or local food sources I can support during this quarantine, like CSAs in DC?
In DC.
Well,
okay.
CSAs, and then another one was in DC question.
Yeah. So there's quite a few. I don't want to single anybody out in that regard. It is as quick as doing a Google search. Farmers markets are still essential, and they're going to be, you know, really kicking off here in the next month. I highly recommend you support those. And I can say that my experience with the CSA that I have, which is Full Cellar Farm, I'm in Frederick, Maryland area, but they do have farmers market availability and CSA availability, I believe, in DC. Which they've been nothing short of astounding. They have no more than 2 people handling my food. There's no supply chain. It's 2 people, then my hands. That's the kind of food supply chain that I feel so blessed. In fact, I have somebody that is gifting me that CSA to support my work. And let me just say that in these times, I could not be more grateful to the family that has done that for me.
Yeah, amazing. So I think, yeah, doing a quick Google search, maybe that could be a resource that we share after this. We'll use our collective minds to write out a few in the area and make that as successful as possible.
And the Maryland Extension Program has a map that you can go on that shows you all of the farmers markets and when they will open and on what days. So yes, please. Great question.
And thank your farmers too when you're buying produce. Say thank you so much.
Farming is a hard thing, guys. It's a hard thing. I know we've idealized it in the last little while, but
all right. So on to number 5. Yeah.
There's one more question.
Yeah.
Were you all at rooting?
Yes. So we Bobby and I were.
What is rooting?
Rooting DC. Bobby mentioned it earlier. It's it's where we first met 4 years ago.
Something like that. Yeah.
And Yeah, basically it's a free sustainable agriculture conference. And anybody who is involved in sustainable agriculture in DC goes. They have a whole tabling area, and then they have breakout rooms. And they usually take over a high school to do it. This year it was at Deanwood, in Deanwood. I forget the specific name of the high school. John Brown High School. Yeah, but yes, Ron Brown, that's what it is. We're right next to Harper's Ferry, so excuse the John Brown.
Year is it? Is it going on this year?
It already happened this year. It's in February. And for those of you that are involved in agriculture, February, it feels like a profoundly lonely time. It is the spot where even the most introverted among us in sustainable agriculture, when we go to this place, it's like, people! I highly recommend it. I'll try to go every year I can. I travel often during the wintertime to different places around the world where I do my consulting, but every chance I get, I will absolutely be there. And I'm pretty sure we'll have representatives from the Reed Center there every year.
Absolutely. Nice. All right. On to number 5, winemaking. All right. So first of all, the connection between humans and alcohol has been very destructive for a very long time. But it wasn't always that way. And in fact, fermented foods and alcoholic tinctures are often considered medicine. And when alcohol is used properly, can help connect and reconnect our microbiome to the earth and to our ecosystem and spirits, really. I mean, it's called spirits. But anyway, I'm not an expert on winemaking. They have a little bit more experience if you want to help, but there's wine and there's mead, and you can make both of them in your backyard.
Yeah, I would just, let's just say, please look up recipes. There are so many ingredients that exist in every ecosystem that you can put into these very medicinal, very delicious mixes. But I kind of want to bring it back to another historical context for this, which is where there was a major shift in alcohol consumption. You want to be able to drink these things by choice and not by means of survival. One of the things that always blew my mind when I was learning about European history was how crazy it is, how much crazy stuff went on throughout the history of Europe. But when you realize that in so many of the urban areas that persisted, there was no plan for any of the waste. So all of the waste would be flowing right down into the water systems that they would be relying upon in order for themselves to be able to drink and live. So what did they turn to? Alcohol. Wine. In fact, and when we say wine, it's closer to like a pretty disgusting vinegar mix. I actually had an opportunity to look to do some research on this in my travels to Germany, which a lot of my family comes from Germany, and to find out that kids all the way up to senior citizens were in many places drinking 100% of their drinking was alcohol because they could not trust their water supplies. Made some of the crazy things that happened in those places not seem so outlandish, you know? And in fact, in some of the places like Heidelberg is one of the castles near where I grew up going often. They had this massive barrel in which you could come to this like hole in the ground, and the townspeople would pay their taxes in wine, and they would mix all of these crazy wine vinegar mixes into a barrel that they would never see. But you can now go underground and see the size of this barrel that is like 3 stories high, where all of this would be mixed. And they would be drinking cases of wine a day in this castle. it maybe explains some of the insanity
Wow.
that we can experience.
And also, I mean, most of the wine production these days in the U.S., where we get our wine, is in California, where there's droughts going on, and they're using tons of water in order to produce that. So I think Eric added that tip in just to bring light to the way that most of our modern day alcohol is produced. It takes a ton of water and it's very unsustainable when you could just be doing it at home.
Right now we're not looking at what is this ecosystem able to produce easily. We can't actually do that. In fact, the only metric that we have if we want to survive as farmers is what can my land produce profitably. I can't look at the long term. What can we produce that we can get the biggest bang for our buck, that we can sell to the highest bidder? And in fact, I'll just, one more nugget that I would love for all of you to take home with you that literally shapes the entire global food system. Please hold on to this. It is that it will never be profitable to grow food for people that have no money. This literally describes the entire food system that we currently live in and who gets allocated what and what is grown where. That's it.
Yeah.
It'll never be profitable to grow food for people that have no money.
On to number 4.
Yeah.
Composting. We touched on it a little earlier, and the importance of composting, but I just want to start off by saying I didn't realize composting was so easy and amazing. And that compost, like Bobby was saying, that usually goes to your trash, ends up in the landfills. And so when it starts to decay and break down, all this methane is created and trapped, basically, and it turns into methane gas, which eventually is then released and is I think 60 times more detrimental to the ozone than CO2. So methane also comes from cows, like we talked about earlier. But
not to the ozone necessarily, but specifically its ability to hold heat.
So I'll let you talk about composting. How can we do it? How easy is it? And where do we get started?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I'll touch on is that people think composting stinks. Composting should never stink. It should never stink. In fact, it should smell sweet and wonderful. If you're smelling stink, what you are smelling is pockets of anaerobic decomposition. What does that mean? It means that there's not enough oxygen. So when your stuff starts breaking down, if you just put it in a pile, a lot of people just throw it in a pile and just let it, when it starts breaking down, oxygen cannot find its way down into that pile. When that happens, an entirely different set of organisms wake up. And those organisms predominantly release their waste as a gas instead of a solid. You want your waste to be released by aerobic, high oxygen loving organisms, and the vast majority of them are releasing their waste as a solid. And that waste is plant food. So that's the distinction. You want high oxygen levels. And I think the other important thing to remember is that, whenever you're smelling those smells, it doesn't mean that your compost can't be used. But what you want to do is put more brown materials into your compost. That's the most common thing that people miss. You have your green materials, which are higher in nitrogen. That's your food scraps, that's your coffee grounds. Even though they're brown, they're green because of the nitrogen level. But it's your active food supplies. Your brown materials are going to be wood chips. They're going to be brown leaves. They're going to be straw, things like that. And those two things needs to be balanced in your compost pile. If you do that, and if you turn your compost pile with some regularity, you can literally have a very little effort, most nutritionally balanced, healthy soil, growing medium that you can possibly grow.
And if you can't make compost in your backyard, there's some wonderful sources online. Like if you live in DC, there's a site called makesoil.com, I'm pretty sure, and you can find soil sites in and around your area where there are people doing the composting, doing it right, and probably up for a trade. If you bring them food scraps, maybe they'll give you guys soil. So see if you can find a resource, a neighbor who might be doing it. and you can partner with to
Yeah.
make it easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And I cannot recommend highly enough. This is the most important front that we can be working on. If any of you could get passionate about composting and start up as much composting operations as we can. One of my dearest and best friends, Phil Westcott, just started Key City Compost here, had to go through all the litigation, had to go through the entire process of, you know, an entire council that had no idea what composting was, and through his efforts has now started the very first composting facility in Frederick, Maryland. You know, this work is nothing short of heroic. It's not easy, and anybody willing to take on that front, please do.
And let us know about it.
Yeah, please let us know about it. We will support you. We will share everything we know. We will consult for free on that front. Please let us know how we can be of assistance to you on that front.
Cool. I think there's a question.
Yeah, there's a comment and a question. So Adam says he keeps food scraps in a compostable bag in a freezer and brings them to food scrap drop-off locations like Whole Foods and Mom's.
Yeah, all right.
And then
Go,
Anthony
Yeah, Adam.
asks, how do you balance pH, or where in the spectrum do you like to be, or do you amend on plant use?
That's a great question. That's deep. So this is a very interesting component. We are taught that certain plants like certain pH, and that in order to grow that plant, you have to have soil that is that pH. And if it's not, you need to amend it to make it that pH. And in reality, while there are preferences to plants to pH, something that's really missing in the equation is that the rhizosphere, the root sphere of a given plant, can actually develop its own pH. You can have a surrounding soil that has a radically different pH than the soil right in that root system. How does that happen? It happens because the plants actually can send out what we call exudates. They send out sugars, proteins, carbohydrates into that root system. They expel it from the roots and feed organisms that actually thrive and literally encase their roots. Those organisms actually create soil pH. Now, yes, you have parent material that creates soil pH, but within that, it turns out that fungal glues, so if a plant is feeding more fungus, it's going to create glomalin, and that glomalin produces more acidic soil. Bacteria produce more basic pH. So if your plant has a wide spectrum of microbiology, if you feed it compost with a wide spectrum of microbiology thriving in that compost, you can have a soil pH of pretty much whatever, and that plant can actually feed the microbes that it wants to have thrive in its root system to create its thriving pH right in the midst of a general ecosystem or a more macro ecosystem that doesn't have the pH that it covets. Now, that's a very deep thing. We get into that in our PDCs in a much deeper, much more robust way. But yes, the answer is I do treat it on a plant-by-plant basis. If I'm growing compost for a plant like a tree that lives in a more fungal environment, I'm going to use more brown materials, which are more fungal foods. If I'm doing it for my veggie garden, most of our veggies thrive in what were grasslands from the ecosystems that we took them out of. So I'm going to give them more green materials. So that's going to produce more bacterial foods. But I know that's probably a little out there for a lot of people. If you produce compost that have a good balance of browns to greens and a good spectrum of healthy microbes, it's probably going to work for your plant to be able to marry with the microbes that it wants to have thriving in its root system.
So it's obviously clear to see that plants are magical. Take note.
And so are microbes. So are microbes.
Transmutation.
So on to number 3, which is pretty new to me personally. I grew up kind of with woods in my backyard, but I didn't really eat a lot of wild plants. Number 3 is foraging. So Dylan just left so that he can go find a wild plant to bring back.
Shouldn't take him very long.
I'm not sure what he's going to be bringing back.
Or if we'll even come back.
Yeah.
Bye, Dylan.
I want to ask Bobby, though. Bobby, what do you think about foraging, and where do we get started?
I mean, I think getting a firm idea of just the plants that are around you in our everyday life, especially small, tender greens in spring, even in our cities, even in the densest of urban areas, food is exploding. Nature is exploding. Some of the same plants that will break down your concrete are going to make room for their tender little friends who are edible and delicious and tasty. So for me, I really like, I know a couple of the
Nice,
ones in this area that go out and look for them, and I eat them, and they're my friends. But it's always, identification is important, knowing what you're eating.
So what do you have here?
So in the span of, what was that,
20 seconds,
30 seconds, I ran outside and grabbed 2 edible plants here. Here we have a burdock, and this has a long taproot that you can use a shovel to dig out. And we cooked it the other day, steamed it, and then fried it, and created like an amazing
It was like a teriyaki,
Yeah,
like seared, like
Can I just let it be public
sesame.
knowledge that I'm a little
Oh.
pissed off that I didn't get to try this? I've heard from 3 people now how amazing this was. No, I just can't wait to try it. Everybody's been talking about how delicious the burdock root that you guys made. Oh, it sounds so good.
Yeah, we made
So
it in
good.
this like vegan sushi. It was like
I took a
sauteed
picture
like
of that on
meat.
the musical plant.
Yeah, check out the musical plant. But yeah, wild foods everywhere. We're out walking on a plant walk, and you're looking at fields of salad. You're looking at trees that are delicious and floral, the perfect toppings. Like
Yeah.
we could go out and pick this much greens and things that are, we could not buy anything else.
Yeah, and I think one of the misnomers is that wild foods, yeah, they're edible, but like not a little bitter. Like these are choice, absolutely delicious edible plants. And furthermore, when you have magicians such as Bobby in the kitchen that can literally toy around.
and Ben. We're all magicians, right?
With a little bit of creativity, there's just no reason why these plants shouldn't be daily components of in our seasonal eating.
Yeah, for sure. One that blew my mind was acorns. Did you know that 1 pound of acorns has 2,000 calories or something like that? Acorns are everywhere. You already know. You can take those nuts and process them into oil. You can make walnut oil. You can make walnut syrup, just like you tap a maple tree for syrup. He tapped a walnut tree. I think he's gonna grab it. But in the short span of time that I've been here personally, I have learned so many readily available and abundant foods that are delicious. Like he's eating a dandelion right now, right? Dandelions, like you said, are super nutritious. Garlic mustard. You can just look up garlic mustard. It grows everywhere. At my dad's house growing up, I thought it was a weed. And many people still think that it's weeds, but you eat it and it's delicious. Chives are another one. Watercress.
By the way,
also.
yeah, I think it's important for everybody out there to know that we all live together. So don't think that we're not doing the proper social distancing. But this is from one tree. It's a 45-to-1 ratio. So, we boiled down a lot of sap to get this. But I have a wood stove in the house, and I always steam on top of that wood stove anyway. So you might as well steam off syrup simultaneously to humidify the house.
Thank you, Ben.
Is there some mint?
Yeah, there's mint in there too.
Oh my
And there's a
God.
question. Someone asked if you have ever tried skunk cabbage before,
Oh,
because
yeah.
they're all over the place.
Yeah, skunk cabbage is not edible. I don't recommend it. Bad news.
Eric said it's like eating fiberglass from some of the specific oxalates or something. That it has a really terrible mouthfeel, similar to fiberglass.
So don't eat.
That's a hard no on that one. Yeah, and that's
So-
the beauty though. There's so much food, and there's lot of not food. But when you know the food and you see it, you go, hey, friend, it's good to see you again.
Yeah.
Can I eat some of you?
So something that we've been doing here, we've challenged each other and ourselves to eat something wild every day. So if that just means a dandelion, go outside and eat that dandelion, okay? Unless it's like on the highway or next to some like jank, chemicals and stuff like that, you gotta be careful. But
try this one. Sorry.
this is different.
Yeah, this is a different one.
And also, I might add the
Yeah, try this one.
resiliency
This is
of
really
our
good.
health that's then increased with these wild foods, because, like, I'm sure everyone's familiar with
Ooh.
local honey. When you eat local honey, you're getting flowers from that area, the pollen and the molecules that are native to that area. So by eating native plants in your backyard and plants that grow in the same areas that we live, you're even more increasing the health benefits of those specific plants.
And I think that's one of the greatest things ever is also seasonally, the plants that become available in the springtime, in the summer, and the fall, they tend to have the nutrient profiles, the water contents that we need at that time.
Yeah.
So waking up from spring, one of the first things to come up is stinging nettles. I'm sure everyone's really familiar with stinging nettles.
Oh, yeah, that's another one.
Want to know why they're so tough? Because they don't want you to know how nutrient dense they are. They are one of the most nutritious things in anyone's garden, in miles around.
Yeah.
They pop up in the springtime. It's a wonderful tonic, highly detoxifying. We made pesto with them the other day.
Pesto from stinging nettles. It's like, what? Delicious. And tea, I might add. You can make a difference.
You can steam them, or you can crush them or macerate them to get rid of the sting, because they're a micro structure that if it's broken, you can totally eat it. Or you can just be really weird like me and have calloused hands and roll them up and just eat it in the back of your mouth and like relish the sting and feel the medicine, because it is medicinal. And there is, it's just a little harder pet.
All right, so we'll end this one on challenging you all to eat something wild every day.
It's
And
also
keep us
been-
accountable too. Reach out.
It's also been raining for the past couple of days, so it comes out when it's been raining and it's sunny for a couple of days. It's something that we all have been finding.
Yep.
Moral mushrooms.
Morels.
Yeah. So check them out. They
Oysters are coming out.
Yeah.
Chicken of the woods is coming out.
So it's definitely mushroom season. So do some research and be careful for sure.
Yeah, and also quick plug for Fantastic Fungi. If you haven't seen that movie yet, it's like a documentary, but it's more of a movie. I cried 3 times personally. I think everyone in this room has seen it. Highly recommend it. Fantastic Fungi. It's worth $3 or whatever. I would pay for it.
Support.
It's actually being streamed for free online right now.
Oh, really?
By
Nice. There you go. On to number 2. And this is a 4-part topic, but gardening. So gardening, like we talked about before, is one of the ways we can start producing, so we're consuming from a system less and producing the food for ourselves. So 4 different types of farming. We'll start with in the cities. And again, I want to repeat, all of what we've been talking about today has been filmed in a very fun and engaging video that is almost done. So we'll be posting that soon. Stay tuned. But I'm super glad we had this opportunity to run through this list here with our friends at the Reed Center, and then and we'll dive more into it with the video. But so gardening, number 2, starting in the cities with urban and container gardening, or if you live in an apartment or something like that. I guess I'll ask Ben, what are some tips for people that are living in the cities or in an apartment or something like that might not have a plot of land? What can they do in their homes or using those cities?
Yeah, so I mean, southern facing windows is a very easy one. There's a couple ways to look at it. One is like growing the simplest plants, the plants that you can go online and look up the 5 simplest plants to grow, and there will be a lot of them. I tend to, so I lived in DC for a decade, and I tended toward plants that I thought I bought a lot, and because I was growing it indoors on the windows on the south side of my house, I wanted to go for tropical stuff. So I grew Meyer lemons, which is a dwarf lemon variety that throws lemons out. I mean, it's pretty amazing. But there's also so many plants that you can start growing now that, when you do get a plot of land, whether that's in a community garden, which I highly, highly recommend, Whether it's in a backyard that somebody lets you use. Sharemybackyard.com is something that I've had a few friends use. So start growing things now that they're great, you know, herbs to have in your house that you use regularly in cooking. But then when you get that plot, you can easily take them out and plant them in your garden. And, you know, I'll just say that for me, I do a lot of things. I'm a very busy person, and I'm sure so many of you are as well. For me, taking care of plants is not really in my cards anymore. If a plant relies on me to survive, that means it dies. So that sounds pretty silly for a guy that's an ecologist, but the reality is the faster you can find yourself into a place in which you can grow plants that thrive on their own, man, it changes your whole outlook on what gardens are capable of doing. You guys talked about stinging nettle. I mean, that's one that will just grow. Now, you don't want it to get out of hand, you know, too much because, you know, obviously your neighbors will hate you. But mint is another one. Every single garden that I've ever grown in urban areas, I've always planted things on the edge of that garden that I wanted every single person that passed by that garden to take, to feel that they can just have, to put a sign that says, take as much as you want of this mint, put it in a cup, put some boiling water in it, and enjoy. Take these blackberries, whatever. I want you to ask questions when you pass by my garden. So there's so many things that you can grow. If for any of you guys that have like postage stamp backyards and you're like, oh, what fruit tree can I grow because you know, I have so little space, look up a espalier. It's where you can quite literally make your fruit trees into a fence. So even if you only have 1 foot on the side of your driveway or a pot, but you don't have any room for a 3D bushing tree or bush to grow out, you can actually have them grow as a very skinny fence that only grow 6-8 inches off of your existing fence or a border with your property.
Yeah, so just to touch up on the urban and container farming for those, or gardening, excuse me, for those people in the cities and apartments, stuff like that. South side facing windows, you can actually build shelves also right next to those windows and have layers of plants growing. There's tons of YouTube videos also if you just look up. And again, the Reed Center will be providing a lot of resources, and hopefully, actually not hopefully, we will be creating more content around gardening and making it fun and enjoyable and easy for everyone to understand.
And for those of you that want to go on a bit of a ride with the work that I previously have done, I started an organization called Can You Love, which was centered specifically around replicable gardens that could be grown in the most densely populated areas on Earth. It's called Can Ya Love, C-A-N space Y-A space L-O-V-E. It's on Facebook. It's on Instagram, I believe. And you'll see some imagery there of very simple gardens where we just took fencing, made it into a cylinder, attached it to itself, lined it with a fabric, filled it with compost, poked holes in the side, and literally could grow from the entire surface area of this 3-dimensional garden. There is a friend of mine that made something called the phytopod, which is an even smaller version of that, where you can make it yourself. It goes into a pot on wheels that you could have in your house. So you just put a small cylinder of soil burlap or some other retaining medium to hold the soil in the fencing, poke holes in the side, grow from the entire surface area of that.
Which leads us into the next part of the gardening, which is backyard and suburban gardening. So if you have a backyard or, you know, even a shared backyard, what is it?
Share your backyard.
Shareyourbackyard.com.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so like what are some ways, let's say we have a 1/4 acre, okay? I'd say the average suburban house has a 1/4 acre. how can we live sustainably off that quarter acre? What are we going to be doing? Are we going to make it all corn?
Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. I mean, we are using a lot of Roundup already, so GMO corn seems like the logical mistake. Please read my sarcasm. So there's a couple things that I would say. One is you'll also see in Can You Love that I designed. These are all patented as well, with the objective that anybody could replicate them as long as they were using them for their own purposes or bettering the world. It's called the growing wall. If you have a chain link fence around your yard or don't have a chain link fence around your yard, what you can do is double up that fence. Make 2 fences parallel to each other so that they are 18 or 20 inches from the existing fence, or just, again, you're building 2 fences that are parallel to each other. You line those with a fabric. You use wire in between them to keep them taut, to keep them the same distance from each other. Fill the entire fence line with soil. And then you can poke holes and grow food from the entire surface area of that. So in those 20 inches, you are now growing, say you go up 4 feet, you're now growing 10, close to 10 square feet of growing space per foot all the way around. So instead of having to take out 10 feet all the way around your yard to grow that garden, you're actually just taking up 20 inches. And you can just put a soaker hose at the top of that to irrigate that and put it on a timed drip irrigation system. It's a very easy system to take care of. The weeding is much less. So that's one thing that I would recommend. People that are in wheelchairs, the primary reason I built that was for people with disabilities to be able to garden for the first time. The first one I built was for a 96-year-old that hadn't been able to garden since she was in her 70s. And she was able to bring out her little stool and do all of her gardening from here to here.
Nice.
So that's one thing that I would recommend. Now, as much of that space as you are willing to fill up, I know lawns are a valuable space. I'm not trying to just beat up lawns, because being able to play when I was growing up in a backyard lawn was some of the most magical time that I ever spent. And I don't think kids shouldn't have that opportunity, but as much space as you can allocate to creating garden space that's producing food. It's also aesthetic, but it's also spiritually healing. Don't think of a garden space as strictly a space where you're producing food or strictly a place where you're producing aesthetics. I've lost a lot of people in my life. In every garden that I've ever built, I have a memory or a respect garden where I can go and it's my space to reflect on and remember the most beautiful times, the things that I can learn from those that I have that have passed on before me. There are ways in which you can create gardens for the exact healing spaces that you need. If you need a quiet place away from the laptop, or a quiet place where you can bring your laptop that your Wi-Fi reaches so you can start writing that book in a hammock. I'm currently writing a book and I do a lot of it in a hammock. So just kind of recognizing what are the healing spaces that you need. Gardens are not these like monocultures of plants, and they're also not monocultures of the mind. Please be open to creating your healing spaces in the same space that you're producing aesthetics and food.
Yeah, even a Zen garden. You can do a Zen garden super simple with some gravel and sand. So I want to touch on the next one, which is rural and forest gardening, because that's what we're really focusing on here, is building that forest food system. And so I don't want to talk about it too much, because I think the majority of people are either in cities or suburban areas. But for those people that are or have the opportunity to become involved with a permaculture or a farm nearby, and growing these trees, basically. So Ben, can you quickly talk about the different layers of a food forest and how we can start to create food forests simply?
Yeah, so, and this is going to be relevant for all the scales, but basically a forest garden is recognizing that in the forests that are thriving, there are plants that thrive in all of the different spaces in that ecosystem. So you have everything from canopy trees to the shorter trees that are fruit trees, to shrubs, to your veggies, all of those things usually needing full sun, right? So you can kind of stack those going from north to south, your tallest tree, your shorter tree, your tall shrubs, your medium-sized shrubs and short shrubs, your herbaceous layer, and your, you can also have, like, think about other layers like root crops and things like that. But then in that same area, you have all this shaded area, and mushrooms thrive in a lot of shaded areas. You have animals that can live in those spaces. You have plants that love shade. And the reason why I say it's applicable to all scales is you don't have to think of, you know, like this region here, probably if you're on the East Coast of the United States, or especially in the mid-Atlantic, that 1 out of every 4 trees was a chestnut. The likelihood that the place that you are sitting in right now, if you're in that region, that you would be sitting in a spot that was a chestnut tree is really, really high. But if you only have a 1/4 acre backyard, it doesn't make sense to have a 100-foot tall nut tree as your, you know, your dominant tree species. But you can start down at dwarf or semi-dwarf fruit tree and then work your way down from there. Or if you only have a postage stamp in the city, you can start at the shrub layer, shrubs that only grow like 3-4 feet tall, and then work your way down from there. So basically what it is recognizing that no thriving ecosystem on Earth has a singular plant dominating a landscape over a vast area. Instead, it's a whole bunch of species that are able to interact. They're all species that are pulling different nutrients out of the ground at different times. And when you do that, the plants tend to be much happier. You tend to support much more species of insects, so that instead of like in your monoculture where you have, say, you know, even in an orchard setting, you have one kind of apple over a huge area. That one apple, if you get a disease on one and you spend millions of dollars to plant that infrastructure, are you going to wait to see is that, you know, pest or that disease going to take over the rest of your farm? You're probably going to go for the nuclear option and go for a pesticide. Well, in a diversified system, you shouldn't have utter collapse of your entire system if you have a diversification. So that's really what we're focused on, is planting plants where they thrive in the wild and finding that niche so that we can grow. It's actually a densification. We can grow way more food per acre than we could ever dream of growing in a monoculture from these diversified systems. Still requires more labor, but that comes, you know, the existential question, should we only have 1% of our society feeding us? And the answer is no. We should all have a part in producing our own food supply, no matter how small that is, even if it's just supporting a hyper-local farmer so he can actually pay laborers what they're worth.
So if you don't have any land and you don't have a house and you don't have anything, how can you garden? Well,
Guerrilla.
guerrilla gardening is something that Eric also will be touching on in the video that we'll be releasing after this. But guerrilla gardening, the idea is that you carry around some seeds in your pocket, or maybe you dig up a plant outside of a store where you see, and kind of just plant things wherever you are, really. And this idea is very fascinating to me personally. Let's take, for example, a gas station, okay? Gas station has, you know, I guess in a more suburban area or something like that, or anywhere, any business will have some land on the outlying part behind their parking lot. Well, that land's not going to be used for anything other than trees and just grass, probably because it's next to a parking lot. But if you know that business is going to be there for a while, you can take a seed or a fruit tree or relocate a plant there and plant your fruit tree or whatever you want, like a fig tree or something like that, and come back the next year, the year after that, and to them, to the Target or Walmart or whoever is looking past the parking lot, they just see plants. But to you and us, we get to go and look at, oh my gosh, that's a fig tree, or oh yeah, that's the fig tree I planted 2 years ago, and it's it's got tons of figs on it.
Yeah, and even easier, let's say lower hanging fruit, if the pun lands. Bradford pears. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but Bradford pears are one of the most common tree along the east coast of the United States. It was planted out by the highway department by maybe even the millions at this point. And it was not supposed to be able to propagate itself, and it wasn't supposed to have big thorns. Oops, both of those things came back, the thorns and its ability to propagate so rapidly, in fact, that when you're on the east coast of the United States and you see white blossoms everywhere in spring, probably 95% of those are Bradford pears. And those Bradford pears can be grafted with any kind of edible European or Asian pear. And the take rate in my grafting has been close to 100%. So you can take this inedible pear that is a nuisance, and it is growing everywhere, and you can turn it into abundant food that in the first year will grow 10 to 20 feet and produce fruit, many of them by year 2.
Yeah.
By comparison, planting a pear tree could take upwards of 5 years before you get any fruit. So we're talking taking this nuisance and turning it into abundance, and it can happen in your neighborhood, and it takes
Guerrilla grafting.
5 minutes per graft.
Yeah, and I want to just talk about this real quick because I got to do my first graft here a couple weeks ago with Ben. And the idea is you take a tree. Actually, you know what? Can you just summarize it?
Yeah.
I feel like you're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, so basically there are trees that are compatible with certain other trees. Pears with pears, apples with apples. And then you have the prunus or the stone fruit, which there's a lot of compatibility there. We're talking prunus is all the plums, all the peaches, all the almonds, all the cherries, all nectarines, and any of these varieties therein. All of those have a lot of compatibility with each other. You can look up 40 stone fruit tree, where one guy planted 40 different varieties of stone fruit onto one tree. But in this case, what we're doing is we're taking a cutting. It's the last year's growth on any kind of fruiting pear and grafting that onto these wild, gnarly, and annoying wild pears.
Yeah, and we'll be touching more on that in some future content. You can also look up YouTube videos on how to graft, but essentially you take a clipping of one branch of the fruiting tree, like you said, and you cut a slice in the bark of the existing Bradford pear, and you just put it in there. And you cover it up with some wax, and then you seal it off. And within 1 year, you'll have fruiting pears, like you said, attached. It's like a mutant.
It's fairly believable that it just happens so abundantly. Like, wow.
All right, so this brings us to number 1. Oh, we have a question?
Yes. So Kyle asked, he mentioned it's a little off topic, but how do you convince those who only care about the money of farming to follow your methods? They would only change if you showed them that your method makes the most money. If I would play devil's advocate for a sec, could you produce more money out of an acre than an unsustainable farmer?
That is a great question. So there's a lot to unwrap about that. I'll try to do it as quickly as possible, and frankly, because of time, I'm not going to be able to cover all the bases on this. This is a huge topic. Great question. So the first thing that I'll say is that most of the unsustainable forms of farming, the reason why they are economically viable is because of subsidies. And in fact, we are seeing the collateral effects of that right now with certain states killing, pork, beef. They're not able to sell the meat that they are producing currently without massive subsidies that are likely to come in order to prop up these kinds of farming. So right now, corn farming in the United States would in no way be a viable form of farming if it was not for the subsidies around them. And in fact, even with the subsidies, farmers are losing their farms at epic rates. Let me just be very frank right now. The reason why we said that you should tell your farmer that you appreciate them and that you love them is that farmers are killing themselves right now. We around the world are killing ourselves at a rate in the United States 5 times higher than the national average. Farmer suicides are a very real thing, and it's happening right here in this region. Right now, before COVID hit, dairy farmers in this area were dropping like flies, and that's because the market said that their milk was only worth 11 cents a gallon. Now, do I think that milk is worth 11 cents a gallon? Actually, I think it's, in many cases worth less than that, because if you had to pay for the collateral effects of all of that, no, it wouldn't even be worth 11 cents, where we have an overabundance of dairy. All that being said, right now, we have programs that are meant to support farmers doing actually the ecologically right things. Even if they want to grow corn, even if they want to grow soy or whatever it is that they want to do on their land, there are programs to help incentivize riparian buffer zones. Riparian buffer zones are areas by streams that are supposed to be planted up into forests so that those forests can actually, if you could turn that off, so that those forests can actually filter out all of the agricultural additives that are currently going down into those streams and poisoning our rivers, our lakes, our streams, our bays, our friends. And those programs are paying lots of money to current farms to put in those trees. Now, currently, most farmers that are utilizing those programs that are literally thousands and thousands of dollars, and in fact, we're going to be entering into one of those programs. I'm not going to get into the details of that specific program right now, but most farmers that are entering into those programs are currently doing the bare minimum of what those programs are actually asking of them. Why? Because it's taking land out of production to put these trees in next to the streams. Well, what we're going to be doing with those programs here is actually using that as a subsidy to produce the kinds of tree crops that are very much sustainable ecologically, but also able to produce an extraordinary amount of economic benefit. So what we hope to show farmers in this area, and what I speak to many of our farmers in this area about, is using these programs to actually turn it into a diversified source of income. So we're talking anything from the radically diverse food forest that they could be producing in that space to a more nuanced, less diverse system that's producing floral cuttings. So for example, there are all kinds of native trees in this area. And in fact, many of our apple orchardists in this area that can't produce apples profitably enough anymore. They can't produce efficiently enough to compete with the West Coast. What are they doing? They're taking cuttings off of their apple trees when they're blossoming and selling those cuttings to florists. We can do that with literally hundreds of species of native and even edible plants in this region. So we're trying to produce dozens of different models of what these riparian buffer zones could look like. So farmers do not have to pay the upfront cost, and in fact make money still off of that upfront cost it took to plant the ecologically right thing to do, that riparian buffer zone. And hopefully in time, once they start seeing the economic benefit from it, actually encroach upon whatever kind of monoculture that they are currently, they've invested themselves in, or in many cases, indebted themselves to.
As you can tell, it's a very complicated and complex topic, which we have
Thank
a
you,
lot
Kyle.
of knowledge on. Thank you for that question. And for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the next one. But I just want to thank everyone here and everyone watching and present with us. Thank you so much for staying with us past the 1 hour.
So much.
It really inspires us to be able to continue spreading knowledge and the love and the light that comes along with working with nature harmoniously. So if anything, we really hope that this inspires you to be more proactive about living a regenerative lifestyle and talking to other people, just getting the dialogue started, really the conversation about this, which brings us into number one. Number one is teaching and spreading the word. This is the most important thing we can do. If you tell one person, that person will tell 10 people. If you tell 10 people that tell 10 people, that's 100 people. So the butterfly effect is all you have to do is genuinely inspire one person, and that person will then inspire other people. So thank you so much, Ben, Bobby. This is Davis and Dylan with Mettā Makers. Thank you so much to the Reed Center and this opportunity that we have. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the Catharsis programming. Again, we'll be getting our video up a little later, and stay tuned for the rest of the programming. And at midnight, we'll be burning the, what's it called?
The effigy.
No, there's a name for it.
Effigy, the temporal catharsis on the net.
The beacon of hope. That's what it's
Hope.
called. The beacon of hope will be burning here up on the hill. So stay tuned for that. And thank you so much. Sending infinite love and gratitude to you all. We hope we can see you in person soon. For the meantime, virtual will have to do. So thank you, and see you all very soon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Can I end it? Are we done?
Yeah, is there any more questions?